Welcome to Assessment in Focus, the podcast where we invite guests to tell us the real stories of digital assessment, transformation, innovation and enhancement. Flexible assessment with integrity is a shared goal between higher education and Inspira, so we're here to discover how institutions around the world are assessing today and beyond. I'm your host, Ishan Kolhatkar, Global Client Evangelist at Inspira, and today I am joined by two old friends, Dr. Peter Alston, Dean of Education Services at BPP University, and Laila Barbe, Director of University Central Administration and Associate Dean at BPP University. Pete joined BPP in 2019 and has extensive experience across a range of subject disciplines in designing, developing and delivering innovative academic programs. Pete's role focuses on leading central specialist services that support and enhance the learner and student experience. Laila, as the Director of University Central Administration for BPP, Laila leads a business unit that operates the core administrative functions of the university. This is a role similar to that of registrar in other universities. She leads a team that does a number of things in relation to exams, results, boards, operations, face-to-face and remote exams, graduation ceremonies, awards and certificates, and in her role as Associate Dean, leads significant strategic change management initiatives, and by profession is a qualified solicitor who worked in private practice and then at BPP. Thank you very much both for coming on the podcast and listening to that very long intro from me, but you both have very big roles. I'm delighted you've been able to join me. As I said, so the listeners know, old friends, I used to work at BPP. I've worked with both of you. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast because I both know the history of what you've done, but also working with you as a customer. It's great to hear what has happened since and where you're going to go with assessment and the challenges that universities face in that space. So, as always with this podcast, I have a number of questions for you, and I'm going to go straight into the very first one. And I'm going to come to you, Pete, first. As higher education evolves, what do you see as the most critical changes needed in assessment practices to better align the skills that students need in the future with what they're doing today?
Really tough one to get started. I think that, fundamentally the most important thing of any assessment task, that whatever you create, is that it measures that knowledge, skills, behaviours or whatever attributes that you're intending to develop and really kind of push that student forward. And if I can talk about what we're doing here at BPP, is one of the key strands of our student experience framework in a minute is concerned with what we call assessment for life, in that we have assessment and feedback that develops and enhances students' employability opportunities, again linking back to what you were talking about, those skills for the future, but also it promotes self-growth as well in their skills, knowledge and attributes, and they can be those self-reflective learners and identify those challenges for themselves. I think if we're thinking about the HE sector, there is still that expectation of what students should get from their education. And there are still some roots in there, I think, about what it means to go to university and read for a degree versus what there actually is today, but also what they actually need in that workplace today. Yes, they need that subject knowledge and they need the skills of the discipline of whatever it might be. But just as crucial as they actually need to know how to use that in the workplace, how to effectively deploy it, how to make a difference. But not only that, preparing them for the workplace that they might join in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, wherever that might be. Now, in terms of assessment, I mean, it would be remiss of me not to talk about the one that's got everyone talking at the minute, which is AI and generative AI, because that is one of the biggest challenges that universities and educations have faced, not just for education, because it impacts on how we teach, impacts on how students learn, impacts on how we support, but also how we assess learners as well. And I do liken the AI space at the minute to my days when I used to teach programming way back when, and Google and Wikipedia came out and the potential impact they would have on assessment, and everyone would say, oh, well students will just copy and paste, that's all they do. But it wasn't like that. And again, I could also say the same when I used to teach maths to undergraduate biologists, and the opportunities that the calculator brought And I certainly did see some of it in the early days. There was a shift in how students approached what they were doing. They'd use search engines and they'd use Wikipedia, a bit of copying and pasting. But Google gave them access to more information than they ever could have had potentially within a library. Wikipedia, for me, and I will still maintain this today, still presents really complex topics in a simple way to get some initial understanding that you can explore further. And so for me, they're the starting point. That's how you can move forward from that. And for me, Gen AI, or the advent of Gen AI, is a bit like that as well. It's not going to go away. It is a critical change for HE to embrace the opportunities. But we also have that need as institutions that we have to simultaneously protect the integrity of what it means for a HE qualification for a degree. But for me, it gives us that really good opportunity to be creative. We can do something different. We can do something better. We can enhance. And the key thing in all of this, for me, is to make sure that students, staff, whoever it is that's engaging, that they can do it in a safe way. They can practice. They can fail. They can understand. And once they can do all of that, they can then be creative and think about what is going to come forward from that. And it's not only students, as I say, but staff also need to be able to do that as well. If we're going to change assessment practice and we're going to really embrace AI, then if staff don't understand the scope or the limitations of what the technology can do, then how can we actually reliably assess students? How can we start to think outside the box? How can we let students think outside of the box? And one of the big things we've done at BPP is we've really focused in on the structural elements and put a framework in place to help support staff and students, effectively the guardrails, as I colloquially call them. But it's there to protect, it's there to advise, it's there to guide students and staff in using generative AI. So we've got things like, we've got a staff policy around AI, so our kind of legal commitments. We've got a university position statement that talks about the principles of how we're going to engage with with AI for learning, teaching and assessment. And again, how we will engage with students and support and help them develop on that. We've got acceptable use policies on what it can be used in assessment, for example. We've updated our cover sheets. We've updated our university regulations around academic misconduct. And again, it's that knock-on effect of all of this is that if you're making some changes to assessment, you've got to think of the wider picture. And the one thing I've really learned, I'm really paying attention to here at BPP, is just how do you operationalise it? How do you actually make this work? You can have these great ideas, but come on, how are we actually going to get this on the ground? And we've kind of packaged that up in relation to AI, and I'm sure Laila will probably jump in a minute on this as well, but we've tried to really focus on the education and the training of how do we develop people to understand this and use this. So we've got a competency framework that we've set up that is really going to help our students, identifies the knowledge, the skills, and the qualities that students and anyone would need actually to be able to navigate those practical challenges when working in the workplace. And again, that kind of coming back to the start of what is that challenge in giving students those skills, they need to be able to use these in an effective way that's going to add some meaningful impact. So we've developed some training around generative AI foundations, giving students those sense of the basics, but also the same for staff as well. And so that everyone has that education in really understanding just what this actually means, so that we can then be in a position to really effectively support our students when we're thinking about the really big changes we want to make to assessment.
Sorry, just to add to that, from the operational perspective, Pete talks about mirroring the reality of the work environment in our assessments. But from an operational perspective, we should be doing this just as much, because the experience needs to mirror what work life is. And work life isn't anymore pen and paper. In reality, it's us in front of our computers. And that happened quite a while ago. It's not something that's just happened now. And that's really the way we need to train our students practically as well.
And they'll get great value from that. And it's because for anyone listening who's not familiar with BPP, a real focus on professions, a real focus on enabling graduates to go into specific roles, perhaps more so than traditional universities. So that's part of the lens on this. But it's part of my follow-up question to Pete on something you said quite early on, which is that the Assessment for Life framework or guidelines for students really does look at things like self-growth. How do you help students to see the need for something that may not be directly assessed in the assessment, but is a useful skill for them, to be something that they focus on. And I say this as someone who wrote a non-assessed module on the bar course, which had a lower uptake than I thought it would. And actually what happened was, when people had finished the bar exams, they came back and said, oh, can I have access to that again, please? Because it's now useful to me. So how do we get students to see that even if it's not directly assessed and there's not a mark attributed to it, there is an importance in those additional areas?
It's an interesting one, and I would liken it again to a while ago, former life, I delivered academic skills, non-credits, bearing assessed module. Why do I need to do this? I know how to write, I know how to do all this. Well, yes, you probably do, but how are you kind of taking the skills and knowledge that you bring to the table, and how are you kind of taking them forward? How are you getting yourself ready for that future world of work, and making sure that you can not just do well, but do really well in the kind of the current environment? And again, you're right with that module you had. I think the easiest way I would describe it is that it's a competitive environment in the workplace. It's really difficult. And what is going to stand you apart? I mean, I'm lucky enough that when I went to university, having a good honours degree was actually one of the things that will make you stand out. But we've got a large proportion of the population is in UK higher education, and degree is no longer the thing that makes you stand out. We do a lot of work in our law school, particularly on that thing around, we call it the O-shaped lawyer. So it's all of those additional skills around just knowing the legal sector and knowing the law. But what's going to really make you stand out in that kind of world of work and get you known and you be seen as the person to go to? And having a good understanding of just understanding generative AI tools and what they can do and how they will transform the legal sector in a big way, for example, wouldn't it be good to be at the forefront of that in your workplace, in your setting, and you being that go-to person that someone can trust and come and talk to you about, and you can see how, and start to influence practice. And that's when you start to get that reputation of being someone who can innovate, because you can be at that starting point and influence. And I always say that it's good to be first. It's always, and I know some people say, well, sometimes it's good to be second, but it's good if you're in first, you get to shape, you get to dictate, you get to inform how things then go on in the future.
Couldn't agree more. And a good little shout out there for the O-shaped lawyer. Anyone who's listening who's not heard of it, certainly look it up. I'll make sure we put a link to that in the description to the podcast. And Adam Curfey, who won't be listening, but I'll make him listen, will be delighted that this got a mention. Another former colleague who's now elsewhere. Now, I want to move on to a second question. In your experience, what's the most significant barrier to digital transformation in higher education assessment? Because we could talk about digital transformation in higher education and be here all day. So I want to think specific to assessment, and how can institutions overcome it? And you've already begun to tell us how you're doing it, but just thinking more widely, what are the steps people can take?
So I'm not going to talk about cost and finances, because I know that is the big thing, or one of the big things that's going on in UK higher education specifically, and there is a lot of noise that suggests there are a lot of bigger things at play. But I there's a number of issues for me, actually, and it links me back to some work I did for my own PhD in 2017, is that I was specifically looking at the enablers and the restraining factors to e-assessments, because I was often called the maverick when I was doing this. Is you're going against the grain, you're doing something different. And for me, it was more than just the simple things like cost and finances and whatever it might be. And I still think they're relevant today in terms of what is going on. And so I would probably list them as, the big one is around staff conservatism and experiences with technology. And we've all met colleagues who are reluctant to not necessarily just change their ways in practice, but a little bit reluctant to adopt some new practices, to change what they're doing. And they could have a valid argument, well, it's working, why change? If it's not broke, don't fix it. But from my experience, that was a big part, that kind of conservatism to change, to do something new, that preference for the familiarity. I've been teaching this module 20 years, it works fine, I get great results. Why do you want to do that? I think linked in with that is, well, very closely, is negative experiences of using technology. If you work with colleagues who are really kind of focused on something and they get a really bad experience, then it's going to be hard to bring them back to the table, to get them to think about something new. One of the big things I found is around the knowledge and the engagement of senior leadership within an institution. So I'm quite lucky. I'm in one of those roles now, so I can be quite passionate and a really big advocate for that. But it goes right across that senior leadership, is that they understand what's required. They share that similar passion for it and recognise the opportunities. And again, I'll give a shout out to Tim Stewart, who's our Vice Chancellor here at BPP. Really, really big advocates for the opportunities that generative AI affords education, really hugely passionate, and is really driving a lot of the work that we do in the university around everything I've just spoken about earlier, around our structures and frameworks. But he's not only focused on what it does for education, but also what it does for jobs, what it does for sectors as well, and that kind of broader piece, how we deliver education. I think the priorities of an institution and the culture that it has also can be a bit of a challenge as well. What's that driving factor? Are you a Russell Group institution that's well known for research, and that's your kind of primary activity? Are you a widening participation university? Are you a teaching focused institution? Are you a university for the professions like BPP? And a lot of that will dictate how you then engage with certain activities, because you might be focused on different things. And then another one, I think, it's the wraparound that goes all this. So yes, you go and buy a new tool like Inspira, for example, and you drop it in and you say, have at it. But there's the whole wraparound piece that goes with that additional investment that you need. For example, we're going to roll out assessment to students that can do it online, but we might need to buy 100 laptops. Did anyone factor that in at the start? You're going to need to train staff to be able to administer this, to handle invigilation issues, to collect the grades. And some of these things are often overlooked from my experience, to when you're making a decision around a tool you're going to bring, have you thought about that whole life cycle? And again, I pull back to one of the really great experiences I've had at BPP is the operationalization. It's so important in how you actually, yes, we've made a decision, but how are you actually going to make this work? And you need to really think about that kind of going forward.
Laila, you're at the forefront of making it work. What are the 2 or 3 things that you think institutions really have to think about in that operational space to get digital change to work, and to overcome the negative sentiment people may have, or it works, why do I need to change this?
Yeah. And I think we do see that, not just in higher education, but, human nature. People are scared of change. And what I would say, I think as an institution, we were scared of change, but luckily COVID happened and we didn't have a choice. And it sort of gave us that push. And my advice would be just to do it. There will be challenges, but there's nothing that can't be overcome. And also what we've seen is the benefits that we have got from using Inspira have far outweighed any of the challenges we've faced. What we're really good at BPP, I think, is making improvements as we go, adapting to change, and also finding solutions when we come across difficulty. And that's been a really good attitude, I think, with this, because we were learning as we went. We didn't have time to make a very thorough plan and transition. We had to do it very quickly, which meant we learned a lot of lessons on the way, but we adapted very quickly. So my advice would be just to be very open-minded in terms of knowing that even if you do come into this and you do face new areas you haven't faced before, challenges, be open-minded to looking at solutions for them. And actually the benefits that we get, and probably listening to these podcasts and all the things that you see across the institutions, the benefits that we get from using this new software really, really have made it worth the change.
And although it may seem like a long time ago since I left, I was with you at the start of COVID, and I remember vividly making 1 or 2 training videos a night for the first, I think, 3 weeks of COVID. And I had members of staff who I'd never met before emailing to say, thank you, that was a useful 4 or 5 minutes. I obviously didn't get the negative ones, but, there's always going to be a balance in these things. But yeah, seeing that open-mindedness that people can have when presented with the right support around it. This is, as you know, I've recorded a number of podcast episodes, and I have the great privilege of speaking to our customers around the world and to educators around the world on a regular basis. And this is a topic that comes up again and again. What's all of the bits of support around this to make sure that I can use it? Is there one place I can look to find where I log in? Are there some basic instructions? Have you provided instructions to me in the right format, that I've never used this before at all? Or actually, I need some digital literacy to help me use this in the first place. which has that added benefit. But it's great to hear, and it takes me to question 3, which again, Pete, you've briefly touched on, but it's more an opportunity for you to say a bit more about generative AI. Which, yes, every podcast at the moment has this. I mean, 90% of my LinkedIn feed is generative AI, but I want to look at it in a specific context. The rise of generative AI, digital tools, it is changing how we define and ensure academic integrity. I don't think that's a question anymore. So really, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to approach it? You've begun to tell us what BPP is doing. Where do you see it going?
It's an interesting one because it is going to change. It has to change, and I think what it does is it challenges. We'll constantly challenge our assumptions of what do certain things mean, and there will be something else. AI is the one right now. There will be something 5-6 years time that again will just has a significant impact. We at BPP, so we talk about good academic practice, and that is the work that you submit is that true, honest representation of your own knowledge and understanding, and kind of focusing on developing your good academic practices. Again, what we're trying to do is to support learners in achieving the award that they're studying for. We want to maintain some integrity in them achieving that award, some transparency in how you're doing it, and how you're bringing your own ideas to the table versus that of the others. Now, what does generative AI afford? Well, I think probably it's the simplest thing. It's that ability to bring huge swathes of information together to summarise and to present you with some pertinent points. If you design the assessment task wrong, then yes, it could probably do the assessment for you. And that's the challenge. Is for me, it's probably less on the integrity policies, but how it's coming back to the very first question you said is how do we design really good assessments? That's what the challenge is now, to try and design out those opportunities for students to be to commit academic misconduct, for example. The way I think about it is we have to prepare students for that world of work, and it's a world of work that we probably don't know exists. Again, for some students who are on a long degree, and by the time they arrive, there will be that expectation that they will be looked to for having an understanding of what it can do, being able to seamlessly integrate, as I talked about, and possibly, again, talking about what we're doing, they're probably going to have to educate other people on this as well. So they need to understand these tools. They need to understand how to use them safely. They need to use them, understand to use them responsibly is the word that we're using at BPP. So things safely, ethically, morally, all of that, but being able to use it responsibly. With AI, like any other technology, in Sphere as well, for example, they act as enablers in that academic process, whether it's you're thinking of ideas, whether it's the writing, but they can do it in a way without impeding on your own work. You still have to feed something in. You still have to put an input in to get something out. And so how do we design assessment tasks that facilitate that I'm having a conversation with a generative AI tool, like we're having a conversation here now, just that it has more knowledge maybe than we might be able to draw on our fingertips to draw on. And so using our assessment tasks and our assessment briefs, how can we build in the use of generative AI to then try and mitigate the risk of students starting to use it in ways that they shouldn't do? So we've created an acceptable use policy, and we've got what Joel Mills, our head of generative AI learning, calls a menu of assessment options. So how much, to what extent do we want to facilitate that use? So it could be using AI to draft me a framework to write my essay, because sometimes that's the hardest part, is where do I start? So give me a structure. I've got all the ideas, I just don't know how to get them down. It might be, help me just develop this argument further. What's three further points I could go and explore further? Or help me just draft some ideas. What's some of the initial things that I should be doing? Now, we are working really close with our faculty to integrate AI into assessments to reduce the need. And I think this is the key point for me, is I want to reduce the need of students having to use it covertly. That's what it is that I'm using it because I don't know how to use it. I've left my assignment too late, I don't understand it all. Let's build that in earlier on in that task. But for me, these things take time. And again, I'll point back to what I was talking about at the start, because staff have to be comfortable in its use. They have to know how it works. They have to know the scope, its limitation, the extent to which its impact. And when they understand that, that's the real opportunity mean that we can start to get creative in how we can assess students and worry less about the academic integrity and more on the skills and good academic practice that we can develop in students.
And we've seen this from an operational perspective as well. When we operationalised in Spira, we had to really think about how are we going to manage the invigilation. It wouldn't be practical or possible to review every full video of a student's exam back to back. It's not physically possible. But we had to work to look at how do we keep the academic integrity, but also operationalise this piece of software. And we worked really closely with our regulators, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the Bar Standards Board, to find a happy medium. And now we have a really good policy that's very practical, that tells us, it correlates very closely to levels of academic misconduct on a particular programme. It's a very agile and dynamic and sensitive policy. Where we see increases in academic misconduct, we're reviewing more invigilation. We're doing more invigilation, and that's just a practical way of how we've applied that with the software.
Absolutely, and it's that practical application of it that is oh so important. I think that there is a colossal difference between putting paper under glass and actually having digital tools and having a digital way of working. I mean, BPP probably less so than many universities, but at an ancient university, you may have a policy written by someone who has long since retired with no rationale to it, and it's still being kept because it's part of the legend that is passed down. And that difference in taking something like generative AI and saying, all right, we can't just plonk it into where we are today. We actually have to look far more widely at what we're doing to make sure that it fits. It's great to hear what's going on, and it takes us into the future. So, Pete, as a sort of future-looking question, here, this is, what do you see as the future of assessment and the role of digital tools, technology, whatever they might be, things that haven't yet been invented? What do they play in that future of assessment?
It's really hard because, I mean, if we look at the speed, if we just take the Gen AI because there's the current one, the speed at which that's developed, surely someone might have been able to predict, but certainly not me, the literal pace at which that exploded. It was almost overnight. The only thing I can liken it to is the impact of COVID had, is that was literally overnight and the world completely changed. I've been using electronic assessment tools probably since the early 2010s. And I think for me, it's the transformational element that it brings to what you can do in assessments. In that you mentioned there about a policy had been written by someone and they may well retire 20, 30 years ago. And one of the biggest things then is to change that. So yes, you could write a new policy, but you will spend more time educating people on why you've changed it, what it's changed to, and just to get to the point you want to say, this is how you can be more ambitious and more opportunities with it. And I mean, I'll talk about an example I did. I used to teach maths to undergraduate biologists for a while, and we used to have paper-based exams 4 times a year. And I was always of that opinion. These are students who are trained to be biologists. They're going to work in a research lab. They're going to work in industry. They're not going to be writing for 3 hours for any long period of time, because I certainly don't do that anymore. And so what I was trying to capture then was, well, what's those sort of skills that students might need? Well, they might go and do psychometric tests. They're going to have to be able to take a test in an online environment in a timed way and answer some questions under a little bit of pressure. They might do it from the home setting. They might do it from a place of work, wherever it might be. So I did quite a few things in kind of transforming that away, so allowing students to take exams at home. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it certainly was at the time I was doing in the institution I was working in. And didn't have to be in a computer centre in the university. You could do it on their own browser. We just gave them some requirements. But it allowed us to move away from different things. And if I can just give probably the simplest example is that we were also teaching students trying to do statistics and understanding. Now, in a paper-based exam, it was really difficult to do some, you were limited to what you could do around the statistical opportunities around testing students, because it was a timed exam. It was only an hour and a half. But I'd found a way when I turned it online, to do multiple different things. I could ask multiple variations of the same question to try and mitigate the risk of academic integrity through the tools that it allow. So I could write one question, turn that into 5, and then do some kind of random allocation to students. So I had a core set of questions, but I could pretty much guarantee out of one test I'd created, I don't know, 200-300 different iterations to mitigate that risk. I could also then push it a little bit further forward. And again, it was just a simple thing, introducing some statistical analysis into the exam that would have been really difficult had I done it on a paper-based exam, because you couldn't really do it live in real time and adjust it as you were kind of going along. But the opportunities for the technology allowed me to do that. Now, it was really hard to do it. It took me a bit of time. But the knock-on benefit from that was actually fantastic, not only from a student perspective, but also from an administrative perspective from my side, is that I freed up so much more time in the future that my efforts then became on refining how can I make this better, rather than just regurgitating the same thing over and over. And we will have that with assessment going forward as we start to think now. So it may well be the case that no longer you just get students to write a dissertation, right? There are ways and means around that. But how can we change that to still test those same skills that we need learners to have, to be able to synthesize a whole load of information, to be able to create new ideas from that, to present it in a particular way that's meaningful to an audience. And it does just change how we do that. And I said the AI piece of it is really making people sit up and think about, how do I do this differently?
And if I think about it from my perspective, the other team that I manage is the operationalizing of the marks, processing the results. And one of the challenges I think all institutions have is just that small window you have between an exam and releasing a result, and how much marking takes place, especially as you scale up. We have some really niche areas of law and nursing where it's actually quite challenging to find the volume of technically qualified markers that we need for a particular paper. And that can be challenging. And so that narrow window really limits us. And if we can develop more AI in terms of marking the actual answers in the paper, that could be really transformative. I mean, we could end up with, almost instant results out to students. And the amount of time and cost and all of those things that we would say would be transformative.
Can I just jump back in on that? Because Laz just made a really good point. Scale is something that I thought I knew until I joined BPP. I'm not saying that we're unique in any specific way, but we are in a sense in terms of the education we offer and the scale at which we work. And I used to think 20, 30 students in a class was big. Then it went to, well, I think 400 in a room is big. Actually, we're dealing with thousands. And again, we used to hire, was it the Excel in London when we were doing paper-based assessments that cost fortune. And kind of using technology now and on all the opportunities that Laila's just talked about, the opportunities it affords, they just didn't exist. What's next?
Well, quite. I mean, I remember invigilating exams at the Excel Centre. It was the easiest way to get my 10,000 steps a day. Getting there is half the challenge, and then walking around it. And there's two things I want to pick up on from your answers. In fact, three. One is that point about scale, which is that one of the things that we have seen has really taken off as a capability we introduced over the last year or so, actually just over a year, is our numerical simulation and symbolic math questions, which are exactly what you were talking about, Pete, which is the ability to write a program model, put in the variables that you want, and you can create, quite easily, we've created one question that has hundreds of thousands of variations. And whether you use that for formative to let people just keep practicing the same skill again and again, or in a summative to randomize is great. In terms of AI, I think there is absolutely opportunities in how AI can assist in marking. And the sentiment that I got last year when I did my effective study across the world with people is that people want different levels of that. Some people want AI to mark everything on a particular module or in a particular formative. Some people want AI as a second or third marker. Some people want AI to enhance their feedback. And so those options are really important. The bit I wanted to come back to, which almost people think militates away from scale, or it's harder at scale, is when we're talking about what we want to do in order to assess students in the future or now, one of the things that we notice is people are, not me, but people are afraid of speaking. People are afraid of presenting. People are very happy to write. And I don't think that is a coincidence. It's entirely tied to the way we've assessed people forever and the way we educate people. You finish by writing something. It's it can't be a master's unless it has this dissertation of a certain number of words. But were someone to say, no, it's that many words spoken out loud, mutiny, people not taking the course, I don't know. So it's how we get past that scale problem, or seeing that it's too difficult to do oral exams. But I say that as someone who, on the bar course, there was 3 advocacy exams and there was a conference exam for all of those students. I actually like the fact that I could mark them in real time. But that's, I think, a challenge that we need to look at in both scale, but also how we can change the way we assess, and that real pressure on marks and getting them out. I think we almost forget how much time is required and put this great pressure on ourselves. And I do say I didn't leave academia because of marking, but I wasn't very good at doing it quickly. And writing good feedback takes time. I would always be the person who would still be up at 3 a.m. marking because it just took me that long to do. But perhaps taking a break after every paper was not the way to do it. Laila, I want to ask you some questions about your use of Inspira. And as I think about it, I think we are now 7.5 years since I switched on the first Inspira exam at BPP. You've come a very, very long way since then. So what lessons have you learned from integrating Inspira into BPP? And what advice would you give people who are either starting out on this journey or have just a year or 2 in with the long legacy that you've got of using it?
I mean, from a high level, I would start by saying what I said earlier, which is just go for it. Go for it and go, and switch and go into the change. But what actually we found very helpful, and we, particularly at the start when we were doing a lot of learning, was our relationship with your representative. We had someone who we could speak to, and we did speak to very regularly. And having that open dialogue was super helpful because your representative had the expertise of the system, but also the knowledge from other institutions. And so that we were able to work very closely with them whenever we came up with challenges or opportunities to implement them in a way that worked best with the software. So I would say make the best use of that relationship and really develop that relationship. And what we did well with that was we brought in people from all levels of our team to be part of that conversation, because I could join those calls, but really I didn't have the experience, the technical knowledge of what's happening on the ground and the system to be able to really get the best value out of that conversation. So bringing the people from my team that did really was a really real benefit to that. But more practically, and more detailed advice I would give to people using this, first of all, is one of the biggest lessons we learned at the beginning was just around the communication with the students. Really taking the time to invest in creating a really good, useful, practical, clear user guide for students. Getting them practicing, using the formative and the summative, using the platform for both formative and summative, so that they come into that exam, they know the platform, they've used it before, they've ironed out any particular challenges the students have with those. So really investing in that student communications piece and training piece. Being very clear with students as to what the technical requirements or versions of Apple operating systems, whatever that is that they need to make sure that they are ready to go when they start with us. And we also learned that from the very beginning we had to be better at responding to student queries, and this is where AI can really help. Pete mentioned this earlier about responding to repetitive questions, but really we had to create a team and a system, operating system, that supported students very quickly and live during exams with particular queries they have. So make sure you've got that infrastructure in place. The other challenge we faced was when we decided that for some of our programs we want students to sit their assessment on Inspira but in our centres. We first tried doing that using student computers, and we really worked hard to try to make that work. But in the end, we learned that that doesn't work very well. And we put a business case into the business, which worked very well. And the business supported to buy a load of laptops. And that was really when things transformed into a really, really positive experience, both for us and the students. Because operationally, we didn't have it's just too difficult to help that volume of students with their individual laptops and the individual issues they might find. So I would say, if you do decide to bring students in centre or into a particular building with the laptops, invest in those laptops, because that really transformed us. And the other thing is we realised that we do need a tech savvy team really running this operation. My team are really quite tech savvy. We have someone who has a background in automation, and he's been invaluable. So, for example, he's been able to do something with the program, which I'd never be able to do, which is that we are now able to set up any number of exams at the same time, rather than one by one manually. So that, instead of taking 60 minutes to set up a number of exams, we do it in 2 minutes, and this is all done automated. So having a team that really understand the software, understand technology, that are tech savvy, I think, invest in those people, train them, that will go a long way.
Couldn't agree more. And the great use of APIs to automate technology talking to one another is a fantastic thing. And so for my final question, you've answered it just in that last answer, but you might want to share more. Can you share examples of where the use of Inspira has transformed either assessment or the administrative processes at the organisation? I mean, I really like the one about automating your exams. It's a great piece of capability. What else is out there?
I mean, it's transformed everything. This whole experience has transformed. Before we were using Inspira, we were setting up exams at the Excel Centre, paper and pen. If you think about it, for us setting up an exam on Inspira, whether it's 20 students or 2,000 students, there's no difference practically, when you're doing that. And as we've scaled up very quickly at BPP, that was a real challenge, trying to find a venue big enough, trying to find enough invigilators from our agency that are available on that particular day, that are skilled and able to be there, for that time. We had a lot of challenges, not to mention the cost around it. That has transformed practically. When we've faced errors in the past, this happens, I'm sure, in all institutions. There might be an error in a question. Imagine trying to get that, especially for us, we're multi-locational, and we've also got students sitting abroad. Imagine trying to get that message out to all the locations in every country, in every centre. In Inspira, we just put an announcement up. It's automated, it's instant, everyone gets the same amounts at the same time. We can add extra time on immediately. That's transformed that. If we make an error on a sitters list and all of a sudden we've forgotten a cohort and there's an extra 200 students sitting, it's happened in the past where 200 extra students have turned up at the Excel and we don't have seats for them. Well, that's not a problem on Inspira. You just add them on. They're on instantly. So it's things like this that really have transformed the setup. But also in terms of marking, we had the logistical challenges of sending scripts around the country to be marked. They'd get lost in transit. We'd lose time, while they're in transit. MCQs, we'd have to feed them through the scanner one by one, and the scanner would malfunction. All these things, and it wasn't that long ago that we were doing all of this. All this is instant, all this is online, and allocating all that marking out is very, very easy for us. I mentioned earlier about the invigilation. We used to have to find, for one exam, maybe 50 invigilators in a room at the same time. Now we have 5 full-time invigilators that are reviewing videos, all the time. That's much. They're very highly skilled and trained now because we've got the same people that we're investing in and training, rather than who can the agency find on the day to be there. It's a completely different level of quality that we've got. And the invigilators also have the evidence now, where they've suspected academic misconduct. They have evidence to present, rather than previously it was against the word of the invigilator. So you can see here, every single corner that we're looking at, there's been a transformative element to it, and there's more we can do. So I know other institutions are able to link Inspira to their student record system, for example. If we're able to get to that point, with our results and our student record system, that will be further transformative. We'll be able to have a much better picture of our students' progression and the amount of added value we can give to the student from that perspective. And also, just to add, I think one thing we haven't really spoke about a lot on this podcast, but that has been the most important thing here, is the student experience. The feedback has been really, really positive from the start. Even with the challenges we faced, the students have been super positive about their experience. We had students travelling into the Excel, the anxiety around the commute, getting there on time, a lot of that has been eliminated now. And, you know, the use of their laptop rather than having to put pen to paper, it's easier to make changes in an exam, it's easier to write on a laptop. You know, I could go on, Ishan, for another half an hour on all the benefits, but you can see practically there's a lot of positive that we've found with the adoption of the program, of software.
Absolutely, and we will have you back on or write it up with you in due course. But this has been great. I am really grateful for the time that you've both taken to talk to me today. It's been a really enlightening discussion and really personally interesting for me to see what you've done in the time since I've gone, and how Inspira is making an impact and how you see assessment changing. And so that's it for today. And that is actually it for season 1 of this podcast. Thank you both for being my final guests on this season. We will be back with a new season later in the year, recording this in late April, obviously wishing you a good exam period. Delighted as well, of course, that this weekend I'm about to watch Liverpool win the league for only the second time in recent memory, which is wonderful. I had to get that in for Pete. Very important that I did so. I will be at events around the world again this year. So I'm going to be in Hong Kong later in the year at Times Higher Education. I will be at InstructureCon in Spokane and a couple of places in Europe, Oslo and one more to be announced. And so if you're around, I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Please do give it a review online on your favourite podcast platform. And I look forward to speaking to you in person. Pete, Laila, thank you once again for being on the podcast. Assessment in Focus is brought to you by Inspira, providing flexible assessment with integrity. I've been Ishan Kolhatkar, and I will see you next season. Thank you very much for joining.